Tell me about confidence levels within the industry at the moment. Do you think that people are getting used to this new norm, this new way of working?
Well, I think confidence is starting to come back because oil prices started to stabilize and people are starting to invest again. The low point of the oil price is only last year, and it's been relatively stable in the 40s, 50-ish range for quite a while. So you're seeing companies start to invest. The leading edge has been the U.S. unconventional market, the U.S. onshore drilling market. Quite a bit of an investment has come back there. The offshore market is lagging, but I think in my conversations with offshore contractors and offshore operators, people are starting to get more confidence. We're seeing more FID decisions, final investment decisions made on investments, and you're starting to see money come back into the market. I think you'll really see it come back next year in 2018.
We've seen some pretty historic changes in the oil and gas industry, some of them for the long term. How do you think business and industry leaders have reacted to that?
Well, this is probably the largest downturn since the downturn of the 1980s in about 30 years. So it is, for a lot of people, of historic proportions. I think what you're seeing that's different, we're in a cyclical business. So we've had business cycles, we have them all the time, particularly as oil price changes. What's different about this one is there's some structural shifts that you see happening. One of the big ones is around people. Most of the people of my generation that came to work in the oil business in the late 70s, early 80s have retired in this down cycle. So it'll be a different workforce that we'll be dealing with in the next upcycle. So that's very different from some of the last several down cycles. Also, you're seeing, particularly here in Europe, a lot of discussion around renewables and their impact on oil demand. You hear people talk about peak demand. And I'll admit, in my travels, it's been mostly a European phenomenon. The European operators and the European business community talk a lot about renewables and getting away from fossil fuels and that sort of thing. Everywhere else in the world, there's no talk of that. But here in Europe, you hear a lot about it. But that's also something that's different. The alternative market, the thought of doing something different than fossil fuels and oil and gas, that makes this cycle a little bit different than some of the past business cycles.
How have the relationships between the operators, contractors, and the supply chain changed over the last 2 years?
Well, a lot has changed in the last couple of years. I think 2 years ago, it was the first reaction of the operators, which is usually to stop work, go to the contractors for a cut in their rates, 20 or 30%, and to basically squeeze the contractors. I think what we're seeing now, 2 years on, some of the contractors have gone under or merged with other contractors. A lot of them are just holding on, still hoping for that upturn. And I think, like I said, the stabilization of the oil price makes people think that we've reached the bottom, but they're still not in very good financial shape. They're still kind of barely holding on. And the old way of just taking the cut from the contractors is not going to be sustainable. And I think people are starting to realize that we're going to have to come up with different supply chain ways of doing things rather than just handing our work over to the procurement group and having them do a contract with a low bid and that sort of thing. That we'll have to do more cooperative, working together with contractors, the operators and the contractors, to be able to bring the technology in that we want, to bring the capabilities that we're going to need so they can be there for operators to be able to execute their projects, because operators cannot work if the contractor community is not there to service. And if we strangle them during downtimes, then they won't be there for us when we need them.
And that different way of procurement, a different approach, do you think that's happening already?
In some areas it is, but it hasn't really permeated really broadly across the industry. But there is still a large contingent that still is more procurement based. And then a lot of companies and a lot of governments require bidding and those kind of procurement based ways of working with contractors. Having alliances, having more of a long-term relationship is not how it's set up, but it's going to have to be, I think, for the long term, because we need them to execute our projects. And if they're not there and they don't have the technology or the people or the kit that we need, we won't be able to do what we need to do to execute our programs.
We still have some Pretty great opportunities for exploration and production developments around the world. Where do you see the priorities for maximising economic recovery, given that a number of assets now are ageing?
Well, a lot of the drive around maximizing recovery is generally driven by either a national oil company or a government. And you see that here in the UK sector, that the government has a real interest in maximizing ultimate recovery from the UK sector fields. What happens with the operators, though, is that they tend to look for maximizing economic recovery and not necessarily barrel recovery. So they tend to sell off properties late in their life to a smaller company that maybe will put more effort into it or put new technologies into it as a project becomes too small for them to really pay a lot of attention to. You're seeing that right now in the Norwegian sector of the North Sea in particular. So you have people like Point Resources, who's buying the Exxon Mobil properties out of the North Sea, Aker BP, which has got the BP properties out of the Norwegian sector. So these are smaller, more nimble companies, Norwegian owned and driven, that are looking at maximizing the recovery from the smaller fields, but they're buying them late in the field life from the major international oil company operators. And that's a trend you see everywhere. The larger IOCs tend to sell properties late in the life to smaller companies that'll spend more time on it. As far as maximizing recovery, though, you hear a lot about that from national oil companies and the governments because they're trying to maximize a national treasure, if you will, and maximize that recovery. So they're very concerned about it, but often who does it changes in the life. And here in the North Sea area, like I said, in Norway in particular, but also in the UK sector, you're seeing that shift right now to these smaller, more nimble, more technology-driven companies.
There is still and always will be a challenge with the skills gap and transferable skills. What advice would you give to somebody considering getting involved with the oil and gas industry in this new climate, particularly women?
I know, particularly here in Europe, there's a lot of discouragement actually of the high school kids of going into the oil and gas industry. They want to get into renewables and kind of that new energy, but all the trends show that we will still need a lot of oil and gas going forward, and there's still a whole lot of interesting projects to work on globally if you come back into the industry. I've spent my whole career working in this industry, and I find it fascinating. It's global. You get to work on big projects, highly interesting countries and different economic models, and there's just lots of interesting parts of engineering and all of it that you get to work on. And I've really enjoyed my time in the industry. It's a fascinating industry and it's global. So I think there's a lot to do and a lot that young people can bring to the industry. There's a lot of upside after this downturn that so many of my generation have retired out. So there's a lot of opportunity for younger people to move into leadership opportunities and management positions because a lot of the older people have retired out. There's also a lot more high-tech, particularly data-driven analysis that's brought into the industry now. A lot of the Silicon Valley influence. We will operate our fields a lot differently than we have in the past. It won't be your great-grandfather's greasy roughneck, what people imagine what the oil industry looks like. It is highly data-driven, highly IT-driven, and there'll be a lot of fascinating opportunities to apply that, particularly in older fields. I think for women, I often get asked the questions around being a woman in the industry, and I was in that first wave who came to work in the late 70s and early 80s. It's different, very, very different than it was when I started. I get questions around working in a male-dominated industry, and usually my first question is name one that isn't male-dominated, because almost all industries are, so you have to learn to swim in that ocean. But there's plenty of opportunities for women. It's really, you're only limited by what you want to do and what you are willing to travel or where you're willing to go. There's really not any limitations on what a woman can do in this industry now.
So in your opinion, what makes SPE Offshore Europe such an important international industry event?
Well, it is obviously the premier show for primarily European-based offshore industries. You see a lot of them at the other offshore conferences like OTC Asia and OTC that's in Houston, but for the European-based companies, this is the show to be at. But it does have a global reach of the delegates. It's got a global reach of the papers and the discussion and the panelists. We have a really flagship CEO panel with people like Bob Dudley from BP that will be there. So it's really a flagship event, but primarily based conveniently for people who are European-based or European companies to be at and display and discuss and do business.
Why should people get involved with SPE Offshore Europe this year? What's your opinion on that? How can people get involved and what have they got to gain?
Well, I think what people need to hear and need to do is to actually to reconnect with each other, to hear about what's going on in the industry, to realize we've probably reached the bottom and that there are opportunities and there are new players in the game. Like I mentioned, some of the smaller players that are coming into the UK and the Norwegian sectors of the North Sea, and that there is an upturn and an upside that's coming. It's not all gloom and doom. We've probably reached the bottom, and now is the time to start making those business connections to be ready for the upturn.